Hi, and welcome to St. Matthew. We hope you're having a great weekend, and we are very glad you decided to join us today. If this is your first time with us, we want to say a special welcome to you, and we hope your visit is a great one. Here's what's happening at St. Matthew. Youth Weekend is coming up on August 16th and 17th. Our youth, led by our youth minister, Josh Fortney, will be taking over all 5 services that weekend and sharing their hearts with you. It is always a unique and special experience, so you don't want to miss out. We have a team in Nicaragua right now doing ministry on your behalf. They are working with the children, teaching love and logic parenting to the local mothers, distributing school supplies, basic medical kits, and so much more. Please continue to be in prayer for this team as they represent our church and ultimately are being the hands and feet of Jesus. Camp season has just ended, and it was an amazing time for our kids, youth, and leaders. It was a lot of fun. New, lasting relationships were made, and God showed himself to our students in many ways. Thank you to all the servant leaders who volunteered their time to be an example and help lead these kids in a wonderful experience with God. Our annual Family Day at Hawaiian Falls is coming up on August 22nd. It's only $10 a person and includes your meal, an all-day pass, and our exclusive St. Matthew only hours after the park closes. Tickets are available now online. That's what's happening at St. Matthew. For more information, check out your worship guide. Feel free to speak with one of our servants in the foyer wearing a purple St. Matthew shirt with any questions you might have. And you can visit our website at www.stmatcpc.org. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you again.
Well, good morning, everybody. I got to tell you, I'm really excited to get to be here this morning to get to visit with you guys. As much as I love strapping on a guitar every Sunday morning and playing, I'm actually a little more excited about this. You see, last year when I was here and I spoke, I got to talk about one of my biggest passions in life, and that's music. Well, today I get to talk about an even bigger passion that I have, and that's worship. Now, let me ask, if I were to ask you, how do you define worship? How many of you would respond with, well, it's the songs that we just sang? Or how many of you would respond with, it's the service that we attend on the weekends? Well, you'd be right, sort of. But you see, worship is far more encompassing than what we do here on the weekends. And it may be difficult to grasp this term, worship. It may seem like just an outdated churchy word, but it actually has a more rugged, everyday relevance. And just for the sake of conversation, for today, let's equate worship with love. But not just any kind of love. A worshiping love is the most passionate, unending, intense love that you can think of. Now, we were created for worship. And every day, whether we realize it or not, we're worshiping something. I want to take a look at a few examples of some common forms of worship that we see often in our culture today. Here's the first one. Yeah. This might hit a little too close to home for some of you guys. And I'll admit, this used to be me. Now, I never painted myself up like this guy, but when I was in college, wake up on Sunday morning around 10:30, 10:45. 11 o'clock, my roommate and I, we would watch NFL Countdown. 12 o'clock, the first NFL game. 3 o'clock, the second NFL game. 6 o'clock, NFL wrap-up. 7 o'clock, the Sunday night NFL game. 10 o'clock, NFL primetime. And 11 o'clock, Sports Center. That's 13 straight hours of watching football. So yeah, I'd say that qualifies as a form of worship. Here's the second image. Now this one should be obvious. If you go to the lengths of permanently inking your body with the name or likeness of a celebrity, yeah, that's got to be a form of worship. Okay, let's take a look at the third one. Okay, so before we come to any conclusions about this, I'm not saying if you work out like this, if you exercise like this, that you are guilty of worshiping it. Quite the opposite, really. your daily exercise and your daily eating habits can be very powerful tools for your worshiping life. But be careful, because this is a slippery slope for many people. It's easy to turn a tool for worship into your object for worship. Let's take a look at Scripture to see what Scripture has to say about what a worshiping lifestyle looks like. If you would turn to Mark chapter 12, verse 30. If you don't have a Bible, raise your hand. Guest services will be walking around. If you don't have a Bible at all, keep it. It's our gift to you. So Jesus is asked, what's the most important commandment? And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. This is what a worshiping love looks like. This is our recipe for worship. And a love like this can't be expressed fully 1 hour a week and can't wait till the weekend to be expressed. Now, we've equated love with worship, so then whatever we love the most, whatever our most important love is, that becomes our object of worship. Now, we've looked at some more obvious forms of worship, but there's some more subtle ones as well. How many of us are guilty of putting our spouses or our kids before God? I know I have, and I'll bet I'm not the only one. So what's the big deal? Why is this a problem? Here's the problem. Whatever we love the most is also what we require the most from. Let me say that again. Let this sink in. Whatever we love the most is also what we require the most from. So when we put our spouse or our kids before God, we're putting pressure on that relationship that it was never intended to handle, and it's in danger of imploding. But when we make God our object of worship, when we submit to Him, we recognize that we need the most from Him. And He alone is able to handle that pressure. Before we go any further, let me state the obvious. However, things that I hear make me think, man, maybe this isn't quite as obvious as it should be. Worship is what we give, not what we receive. So yeah, that may seem obvious. Yet, after worship services, I'll hear comments like this. You know, worship wasn't really good today. I didn't know the songs. Music was too loud. It just wasn't good worship. Music was too soft. I couldn't feel the music. It wasn't good worship. So-and-so wasn't preaching this weekend. Let's be truthful here. How many here, if you'd have known Rick wasn't going to be here and I was, how many of you would have said, I'll sleep in on Sunday. I'll catch him next weekend. It's okay. I'm not offended. I get that. Or how about this? Somebody was sitting in my chair where I usually sit. I had to sit somewhere else. It just wasn't comfortable for me. All this construction they have going on, I had to park farther away, I had to walk a lot farther to get to the church. It just wasn't comfortable for me. It wasn't good worship. It was too hot in the ark, or it's too hot in the sanctuary. Could somebody please get a handle on this air conditioning here at the church? Don't they know that it's not good worship if it's uncomfortable? If you find yourself falling into this trap and having these thoughts, I want you to contemplate something. What do you suppose Jesus' comfort level was the last time he worshiped God on earth as a man? Nailed to the cross. This should give us some perspective. In your notes, point number 1, love God with all my heart. Now, when we read this, we tend to lose a little bit in translation. We equate the heart with the emotion. But for the Hebrew people during Jesus' time, the heart represented the volition or your will. So your heart equals your will. And you worship God with your heart by daily submitting to the will of God. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus states, "Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness." For those of you that don't know, I have a wife and 2 kids. This is my family. And before we go any further, let me answer 2 questions because I get these all the time. Yes, that really is my wife. No, I don't know how I got her to marry me. But thank God she said yes. There are very few things in life that bring me more joy than being a husband to Kristen and a daddy to Aiden and Ava. Now, many of you probably already know this, but for those of you that don't, my son Aiden, he's not my biological son. I met Aiden when he was 8 months old, and I always thought of him as my own, but legally, he wasn't my son yet. And my wife and I, we had to deal with a lot of fear regarding this, but who was going to have influence over Aiden's life? Well, one of the most transformational worship experiences I've ever encountered happened a couple of years ago. It was June of 2011, and my wife calls me, and she says, "What's the best news I could give you right now?" And I jokingly responded with, "The biological father is going to sign over the rights, and I'm going to get to adopt Aiden." Because that's never going to happen, right? She says yes. Instantly, I became overwhelmed with so much emotion that I couldn't contain myself. I couldn't stop crying. And if you know me well enough, you know I'm not much of a crying person. After I got off the phone with my wife, I immediately called Rick to tell him the good news because he knew well the situation and the fears that we had been dealing with. And Rick, recognizing the situation for what it was, says, "Okay, Chris, we need to do something. We need to pray right now." You see, daily seek the will of God, daily. And in the midst of that prayer, of giving thanks to God for this incredible gift, I heard the voice of God saying, "Okay, Chris, I've done my part. Now it's your turn." I heard the call of God on my life very loud and clear that day, and that was to be a father to Aiden. And that first moment there in the hospital room, when I got to hold Ava for the first time and look down at her, I heard that same call again. For all you parents out there, you've heard this call to be godly parents to your children. But loving God with your heart, worshiping God with your heart, means saying yes not only on these days, but on those nights it's the middle of the night and your baby wakes up because she's crying from teething or sick, and you don't want to get out of bed, but you do it anyway. It means not only saying yes the day of your baptism, it also means saying yes 5 years later when nobody's looking, and it's not so easy and it's uncomfortable. You still say yes to God. It may mean sacrificing an hour out of your weekend experience so that you can go serve with the children's ministry or the nursery so that the kids down there have somebody to spend time with them. It may mean taking some vacation time so you can go serve on a mission trip. Or it could simply be having that uncomfortable conversation with somebody that you know doesn't have a relationship with Christ. Whatever the case is, we worship God with our hearts when we daily seek His will for our lives and we daily say yes, no matter how hard or how uncomfortable or how unpopular it might be. In your notes, point number 2, love God with all my soul. Now, I'll admit to you, this is a struggle for me. Because with the soul, that is where your emotions come into play, and I don't trust the emotions. I'm a bit of a logical guy. My connection with God has always had more of a mental focus than anything else. If you were to ask my wife what's the most annoying thing about me, she'll tell you that I'm too logical. And I am. I'm logical to a fault. But because of that, I tend to not trust the emotion. I find it very subjective and fleeting. But as I was seeking understanding about this, I found that the Hebrews, for them, when they talk about the soul, it does talk about the emotions, but it represents an even deeper reality, and that is your innermost being. So it's the recognition that God is closer to your soul than you are. Paul says in Acts chapter 17, "For in him we live and move and have our being." Now, we can choose to ignore this reality and think of ourselves as autonomous, as self-sustainable people, but it doesn't change the fact that God truly is the giver and sustainer of life. But when we accept that reality and we live in that reality, then we begin to worship God with our soul. So how do you do this? How do you daily submit your soul to God? This is where your prayer life comes in. Last week, Jeff did a great job of pointing out how so many of us handle this part of our life. We have this God time, and it's, for most of us, in the morning. So we sit down in the morning, have our scripture, prayer. Okay, I can check off my God time and go on to the next item on the list, and then the next item, and then the next item. May I suggest that your God time isn't an item on a checklist. It's the entire checklist. Whether you realize it or not, God is speaking to you always, and he's always listening to your thoughts. If you don't do this already, pray without end. This has been a challenge for me, something I've been challenging myself to continue to pray continuously. I know it might offend some people when they see me leave my hat on during a prayer. And if this offends you, I apologize. I mean no disrespect. But you see, whether I'm wearing a hat or whether I'm not, God's still talking to me, and I'm still talking to him. When I wake up in the morning, when I'm driving into work, when I'm visiting with people, when I eat, when I go to bed, the conversation never stops. When you say amen at the end of a prayer, don't treat it like a period, like the end of the conversation. Make it a comma. Let that conversation continue. Because God is speaking to you always. Your prayer life is really an outpouring of an even deeper reality, and that's your desire, your hunger for God. How much do we hunger for God? How much do we long for God, really? Think about it this way. How many times today have you thought, man, this air that I get to breathe, man, I really like it. I really appreciate this air that I get to breathe. You probably haven't had that thought today, have you? And I would suggest it's because we don't fully appreciate the possibility of the absence of air. Now, I'm going to ask you guys to do something here in just a moment, sanctuary as well. I want you to hold your breath as long as you can. Don't do it just yet, but when I tell you, hold your breath as long as you can. I'm going to continue to talk. Everybody ready? Okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1. Hold it. And just think. How much more are you thinking about air right now? How much more do you desire for air right now? How much more are you longing for air now than you did 10 minutes ago? And who do you think gives us this air that we breathe? Okay, if you haven't done already, go ahead and start breathing again. We don't want anybody to pass out. But for so many of us, this is how we view our relationship to God, that we don't develop that hunger, that longing for God until we feel as though he is absent in our lives. And for so many of us, our transformational worship experiences don't happen until we hit rock bottom, because it's then and only then that we appreciate the possibility of the absence of God in our lives. And then and only then do we develop that sense of hunger, that desire that God calls us to have for Him every day. But what if we could develop a state of discontent in our relationship to God? What if we were never satisfied with how close we were to God? What if we had this insatiable appetite for God that could never be fully met? And every day that we woke up, the most important thing for us that day was to be closer to God, to seek God in a new way, be closer to Him that day than we were the day before. When we develop that sort of hunger, that desire, that's when we're worshiping God with our souls. In your notes, point number 3, I'm getting ahead of myself. Love God with all my mind. Now, I could write a dissertation on this topic here. As a matter of fact, someday I just might. But today I'll spare you my lecture. I'll stay off my soapbox. If you would turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. We're going to pick up in verse 10. Paul says, "The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except their own spirit within them? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. What we have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may understand what God has freely given us. This is what we speak, not in words taught us by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, explaining spiritual realities with Spirit-taught words. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness and cannot understand them, because they are discerned only through the Spirit. The person with the Spirit makes judgments about all things, but such a person is not subject to merely human judgments. For who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things. We have received the Spirit so that we may understand. We have the mind of Christ." One of the biggest problems I see plaguing the church today is the ignorance of the faith community about what it is they truly believe. But why is that? I would suggest that for far too long, we have neglected to submit our minds to God as a form of our worship, to seek to use the intellect as a gift from God, as a tool for our worship to God, as we try to understand the deeper meanings that God has given us the Spirit to understand. In Romans, I think it's in chapter 12, Paul reminds us, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is." So we talked earlier about daily seeking the will of God, but Paul reminds us, if we don't transform our minds first with the mind of Christ, if we don't seek to worship God with our minds, we're never going to know what God's will for our life is. There's a demographic, I would say age 18 to 25-year-old people that are leaving the church. And when I get a chance to visit with some of these people, I'll ask them, what is it about the church that makes you want to leave? And you would be surprised how often I hear comments like, well, I have questions about the faith that nobody can answer. Or I have questions about the faith that I'm told I'm not supposed to ask. Why is that? Why don't we ask the questions? Why aren't we seeking the deeper meanings? Think of it this way. Take it a statement of faith like Jesus died for my sins. Now, if I can't explain that statement of faith any deeper than that, all I'm doing is writing a check, and I've got no money in the bank to back it up. All it is a worthless piece of paper. Now, it may be all that I need, but it's of little use to anybody else. We have the mind of Christ. Why don't we use it as a part of our daily worship? If you don't do this already, ask questions about what you believe. When you ask questions, you're not revealing doubts. Rather, it's your faith seeking understanding. That is such an important concept. Now, hear me loud and clear when I say you're never going to think your way into a relationship with God. But once that relationship begins, it's incumbent on all of us to seek to worship God with our minds and seek to understand these deeper meanings, to use our intellect as a part of our worship to God. We read time and time again in the gospel accounts where Jesus was frustrating the powers that be. But the most infuriating moments for the Pharisees were all of those times where Jesus outwitted them. Make no mistake, Jesus was always the smartest man in the room. Always. Amen. And we have the mind of Christ. You see, we were meant to wrestle with our faith. It wasn't meant to be easy. What does Paul say? Seek out your salvation with fear and trembling. But so many of us, we don't want to do that. I don't know how many of you guys remember those buffets. I still see some all-you-can-eat buffets around, but whenever I was growing up, it seemed like there was an all-you-can-eat buffet on every street. Sometimes there was 2 or 3 buffets. And my family, we would go to these buffets all the time. So imagine you're at this buffet, and you get to the end of the line, and there's this trough that's filled with mush. And you ask the waiter, you say, what's this mush? And he says, well, you know, we have people that come in here, and they really don't want to chew their food. So we have people on staff. They chew the food for you, and then they spit it out here in the trough. Enjoy. Sounds delightful, doesn't it? Yet for so many of us, this is how we handle our faith. We don't want to chew on the faith. Rather, we're content just to leave that to a professional, and then we come here on the weekends just waiting for them to spit it out to us so that we can consume it nice and easy. Nothing good can come from a faith community that chooses to remain ignorant about what it is they believe. And if you don't believe me, in your spare time, go check out the state of the church, early 1500s, leading up to the Reformation. And you'll see what happens to a faith community that chooses to remain ignorant about what they believe. If you're not already doing this, I want to challenge you at some point throughout the day, put the cell phone down, turn the TV off, read your Bible, and start asking questions. Because I promise you, God has all the answers. God never cowers from a question, and neither should we. In your notes, point number 4, love God with all my strength. Turn to Romans 12, verse 1. This is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. Paul says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." So Paul is reminding us of a reality that's often overlooked within the church, and that is the physical matters. There's a dualistic theology that's been around for ages, and it's still apparent today, And what that theology dictates is that the sinful part of humanity resides only in the physical arena. And the only way to redeem yourself is to allow your spiritual side to conquer your physical side. This simply is not true. Who created the physical body? Who created the physical earth that we live in? God did. And what did God say after he created the physical? He said, "It is good." And it's high time we redeem what God created for good and use it as a part of our daily worship. One of my favorite authors is a man by the name of Brother Lawrence. He lived in a monastery in the 1600s in France, and he's most famous for his book entitled The Practice of the Presence of God. Now, he had a fairly low position in this monastery. He washed the dishes, and he repaired sandals. Yet he was regarded as one of the most respected men in that monastery, and people were constantly seeking his guidance. But his method was quite simple. Whatever he was asked to do, he used it as an opportunity for worship because he recognized he was always in the presence of God, always. What impact could this have for the church if we adopted this method? If every task, however menial or uncomfortable or simple it may be, we said yes and chose to use it as an opportunity for worship. I get a lot of joy out of observing people that practice this method. As a matter of fact, I want to show you a video of people demonstrating worship with their strength. This happens every weekend before any of us arrive. There's no moving soundtrack here. There's no creative lighting or creative angles with the video. There's no onlookers. There's nobody cheering. Nobody saying, "Hey, good job, guys." It's just a group of guys that are so consistent in their worship to God with their strength that every Saturday before anybody shows up, they come here and set up the chairs so that we have a place to sit down when we get here. What an incredible example of what it means to worship God with your strength. And let me remind you, we never retire from our worship to God. I know the American dream is you work for a time and then you retire. Everybody's working for their retirement, right? As long as you have a heartbeat, as long as you're breathing in air, you have the opportunity to worship God with your strength. One of the biggest heroes in my life is my grandfather. There's a picture of him. And Sanctuary, I don't know if you guys can see this too. Go ahead and take the picture off. Because guess what? My granddad is actually here this morning. Hey, Papa, could you stand up? This is one of my biggest heroes in my life. Now, let me tell you why. He turned 91 years old this year. 91. And this year also marks 67 years this man has served in law enforcement. 67 years. He's 91 years old, and he still continues to serve. Not to draw a paycheck, but because he recognized a long time ago the call that God put on his life. And he's decided that as long as he's got a breath, he's going to continue to serve God with his strength. What amazing legacy this man has left on me and my family about what it means to worship God through your work, through your strength, through your bodies. We never retire from our worship to God. Now, we've looked at all these four areas, the heart, the mind, the soul, and the strength, in isolation. Looked at each one of them by themselves, but they weren't intended to be lived out that way. They are interconnected. They cannot be separated from each other because they represent every fiber of our being. So when God calls us to worship Him in all of these ways, He's calling us to turn everything that makes us who we are and submit it to Him daily. God gives us a vision for worship. If you would turn to Revelation chapter 21, it's the last book of the Bible. It's the second to the last chapter of the Bible. As you're turning there, I want to point something out. I find this interesting. At the very end of the Bible, He talks about worship. At the very beginning of the Bible, He introduces worship. So the most important book that we have to read begins and ends with worship. Think about that. It says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and He will dwell with them. They will be His people, and God Himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.' He who was seated on the throne said, 'I am making everything new.' Then He said, 'Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.' He said to me, 'It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end.'" So we get just a glimpse of what this heavenly worship is going to be like. But you see, we don't have to wait for this day to come to begin to worship God in this heavenly way. So often we say, "On earth as it is in heaven." This is how it is in heaven. It can be like that on earth. We've said that to worship God is to love God. So it all comes down to that one point, love. In 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, Paul states at the end, "And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." Why? Why is love the greatest? Well, as we think about this heavenly worship, you think about faith. Faith is believing what you don't see. Well, when you finally get to see it, guess what? There's no more need for faith. Hope is longing for a future to come about. Well, when that future is realized, there's no more need for hope. What are we left with? Love. Love is the one eternal gift that God gives us. It's the one way that can characterize our earthly relationship to God and our heavenly relationship to God. You see, I believe God welcomes our worship, not for Him, but for us. Because it's only when we make God our first love, when we pull ourselves out of the center of our universe and put God there and submit to Him, it's then and only then that we understand what love is. And then God frees us to love each other. What if the church understood this kind of love? Think about that. What if the church understood this kind of love? How many forgotten people would we begin to see? How many forgotten children would we begin to care for just the way Jesus would have? How many long-standing grudges would be let go? What if we could finally see the end of the war between Islam and Israel? What if we finally realized that we are bound together no matter how isolated we try to be, and recognize that we all need Christ and that we all need to imitate Christ's love to others? God welcomes our worship because it's then and only then that we understand this form of sacrificial love. So it's reality check time. What is your object of worship? What do you spend the most time thinking about, really? Is it God's will you seek for your life? Or is it really your own will, and you're using God as a way of validating what it is you want? How much do you hunger for God? How much do you yearn for God? I invite you now, and Judy, I hand it over to you in the sanctuary. Find a posture of prayer. And as the song plays, I want to invite you, don't sing along, rather listen. Listen for the voice of God, because God's speaking to you right now. And when you hear the voice of God, respond with worship. As we go from this place, as the worship service concludes, let me remind us all, our worship does not. Daily seek God through your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. Don't wait till next weekend to worship God again. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Have a great week.